The call came through at 2:40 in the morning, Pacific time, while I was shoulder deep in the server racks of Cascade Commerce Bank in Seattle. I was trying to isolate a highly sophisticated ransomware strain that had completely locked down their entire regional network. My phone buzzed against my belt. I ignored it. It buzzed again, then a third time. I finally pulled off my work gloves and checked the screen. It was Dwight Briggs, my supervisor at Apex Sentinel Solutions. He was calling from headquarters in Boston, where it was already normal business hours. I almost did not answer. When you are managing a critical cybersecurity incident that is costing a financial institution $250,000 per hour in lost operations, calls from corporate middle management feel very low priority. The red warning alerts flashing across every screen in the data center seemed far more urgent. But I answered anyway. 16 years of being the guy who fixes the unfixable builds habits that are hard to break. The discipline I learned during my 8 years in the Navy, managing communications security on an aircraft carrier, does not just disappear. I answered as I always did, stating my last name. Gary Vance here. Dwight did not waste time with pleasantries. He told me that after a careful review of our department budget, the company had decided to restructure. He said my services as senior security architect were no longer required, and my employment was terminated effective immediately. I stared at the main monitoring console. The malware, a customized variant we called Lockdown 72, was still actively encrypting backup arrays. The core banking systems, cash machine networks, and online portals were completely dark. Teresa Miller, the bank's technology director, was standing 10 feet away, staring at me with panic in her eyes because she knew I was the only person who understood their custom infrastructure. I told Dwight that I understood, and that I would let the bank's leadership know that he would be taking over the recovery process. There was a long pause on the line. Dwight asked which recovery process I was discussing. I explained that Cascade Commerce was in the middle of a total blackout. I told him the database encryption was 65% complete, and the financial impact was already mounting at a rate of $250,000 every single hour. I told him I was in the middle of extracting the memory keys to stop the propagation, but since I no longer worked for the company, I would pack my tools and brief Teresa before leaving. Dwight stammered, telling me to wait and that we could discuss my employment status after the database was restored. I told him that was not appropriate. A terminated employee has no legal right to touch a client server. I hung up the phone. My name is Gary Vance. I am 53 years old, and I had just been fired in the middle of a multi-million-dollar banking crisis. Before I explain how the next 48 hours unfolded, it is important to understand why Dwight's phone call was the single most expensive mistake he would ever make in his career. I joined Apex Sentinel in the year 2010, back when it was a small boutique security firm. I specialized in custom authentication architectures for regional banks. Before that, my time in the Navy had taught me how to analyze complex signal routing and encrypt communications under extreme stress. In the civilian world, those skills translated to saving regional banks from complete collapse. Over my 16 years at the firm, I had personally resolved nearly 300 critical security emergencies. I knew the unique setups of our clients because I had helped write the code for them. My wife, Sarah, always said I could read server logs faster than most people could read the morning newspaper. We had been married for 28 years, and she had supported me through countless late-night emergencies. Our 2 children were grown now, both working in stable careers, which left me with the freedom to travel at a moment's notice when a client was in trouble. But that deep institutional knowledge was exactly what Dwight had decided was too expensive to keep on the payroll. He was a numbers guy who only saw my salary on a spreadsheet, completely blind to the fact that my experience was the only safety net the company had. The current crisis had started 30 hours earlier when Cascade Commerce Bank reported that their entire network had gone offline. They had 38 branches across the Pacific Northwest, and they processed a massive volume of transactions. With the network down, they could not process payroll deposits, wire transfers, or clear checks. Their retail customers were locked out of their accounts, and their cash machines were useless. Our remote response team had tried to solve it from headquarters but failed. The attackers had used a zero-day exploit in the custom login portal that Apex Sentinel had designed 3 years prior. It was a complex security hole that allowed them to execute code at the system level. Because I had overseen that installation, I knew the specific memory addresses they had targeted. I had boarded a flight to Seattle the previous morning, arriving at the data center to find Teresa and her team in a state of absolute despair. They had already been offline for almost 2 days. I had spent the last 12 hours tracing the infection and mapping the encryption routine. I was incredibly close to finding the key when Dwight's call interrupted me. I packed my laptop, put my cables back into my briefcase, and prepared to walk away from a disaster that was about to spin completely out of control. Teresa Miller looked like she was about to faint when I set my tools down and began closing my laptop. She asked me what was happening, and I told her that I had just been laid off by my employer. She could not believe it. She pointed out that I was in the middle of restoring their entire database and that nobody else had been able to make any progress. I explained that without active employment status, my liability insurance was void, and I no longer had legal authorization to access their systems. She begged me to stay, pointing out that every single hour they remained dark cost them $250,000, which amounted to $6 million a day. Over this weekend alone, they were looking at a loss of $12 million, not including regulatory penalties from federal banking authorities. I told her I was deeply sorry, but my hands were tied. If I continued to work on their servers as a non-employee without a formal contract, I would be violating federal computer access laws. Specifically, under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, unauthorized access to a protected financial system is a serious offense. I could not risk my career and my freedom because my supervisor wanted to cut corners. I explained to Teresa that the bank's custom login portal utilized an assembly-level registration system that I had personally written years ago. The attackers had executed a Stack Overflow that corrupted the pointer addresses, allowing them to bypass the security handshake. To fix this, someone had to write a custom debugger script to inject dummy packets and force the database to release the master decryption key from volatile memory before it was overwritten. If a junior engineer attempted to do this without knowing the exact memory layouts, they would likely corrupt the database entirely, causing permanent data loss for all 38 branches. It was a delicate task that required years of experience, not just standard compliance training. While we were arguing, my phone rang again. This time it was Roger Albright, the Chief Technology Officer of Apex Sentinel. Roger was a seasoned executive who understood the technical realities of our business much better than Dwight did. He did not sound happy. He told me he had just spoken with Dwight and that there had been a massive administrative error regarding my position. He told me to disregard the termination notice and to focus on getting Cascade back online immediately. I told him that was not how it worked. I had received a formal verbal termination from my direct supervisor, effective immediately. As far as the law was concerned, I was no longer an employee of the firm. Roger tried to appeal to my loyalty, mentioning the 16 years I had spent helping build the company. I told him that my loyalty had been dismissed the moment Dwight decided my salary was a burden on the quarterly spreadsheet. Roger then tried to pressure me, suggesting that if the bank suffered catastrophic losses because I walked away, Apex Sentinel might hold me legally responsible for neglecting my duties. I had to laugh at that. I told him that since they had fired me, I no longer had any duties to neglect. In fact, if I did touch their systems, I would be exposing both myself and the bank to massive legal liabilities. Under the current circumstances, if I worked on their network, I could be prosecuted for unauthorized computer access under state laws. I told him that my clean record was worth more than his corporate client's database, and I would not risk a federal felony charge just to bail out a supervisor who had just thrown me under the bus. I told Roger that if he wanted to resolve the crisis, he should send another engineer. Roger knew, as well as I did, that the only other person who understood Cascade's custom authentication system was Edward Fowler, who was currently on site at a major credit union breach in Oregon. Edward would not be available for at least 10 days, and even then he would need days to review the documentation. Cascade did not have 10 days, they had hours. I told Roger that I was leaving the facility and would be at my hotel down the street if they needed to contact me through formal legal channels. I closed my bag, shook Teresa's hand, and walked out of the data center. The cool Seattle air was a sharp contrast to the hot, noisy server room. I walked back to my hotel, checked in, and lay down on the bed. For the first time in 16 years, I did not have to worry about a client's network crashing. I fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted from the long flight and the hours of intense troubleshooting. When I woke up a few hours later, I saw that my phone had dozens of missed calls from both Dwight and Roger. I chose to ignore them. I walked down to a nearby diner, ordered a cup of black coffee and a plate of eggs, and enjoyed a quiet breakfast. It was strange not having my phone buzzing every 5 minutes with a new security alert, but I was beginning to realize that my retirement planning might start a lot sooner than I had originally anticipated. My family would certainly appreciate having me home for the holidays instead of spending them in drafty server rooms in random cities. As I sat in the diner, I started sketching out a plan for my own independent consulting practice, realizing that the demand for my specific skills was much higher than the supply. I was still finishing my breakfast when Teresa Miller called my personal mobile number. Her voice was trembling with exhaustion and anxiety. She told me that she had just spent the last 3 hours on the phone with Apex Sentinel executive leadership. She had demanded that they send another qualified engineer to handle the emergency, but they had finally admitted that they had no one available. Edward Fowler was stuck in Oregon, and the rest of their incident response team lacked the training to reverse engineer the customized authentication algorithms that I had designed. Teresa told me that the bank could not afford to wait even another 12 hours. They were already facing massive public backlash, and their commercial clients were threatening to move their accounts to larger national banks if the system was not restored by Monday morning. Teresa explained that the bank's executive board had just held an emergency meeting. They were receiving frantic calls from state regulators and federal compliance officers, warning of severe penalties if the system remained offline. The financial impact was growing by the minute, and the public relations disaster was worsening as customers found their credit cards declined at grocery stores and gas stations. The bank was desperate for a solution. Teresa then asked if she could hire me directly as an independent consultant. I had anticipated this question and had spent my breakfast calculating the terms. I told her that we would need to check the service agreement between Cascade Commerce Bank and Apex Sentinel. Most of those contracts had strict exclusivity clauses that prevented clients from hiring Apex employees or recent ex-employees. Teresa said she had already anticipated that and had run the contract by the bank's general counsel. The legal team had found an emergency exception clause in the service level agreement. The agreement stated that if Apex Sentinel failed to provide qualified incident response personnel within 24 hours of a formal request, Cascade had the right to hire external experts to mitigate their losses. Since Apex had formally acknowledged in writing that they lacked the resources to resolve the issue immediately, the bank was legally clear to bring me on as an independent contractor. Furthermore, the contract allowed Cascade to deduct my consulting fees directly from their outstanding balance with Apex Sentinel, meaning Apex would effectively pay my bills. I told Teresa my terms. I was no longer a salaried employee working for a flat rate. If I was going to step back into the fire as an independent contractor, I wanted to be compensated for the risk and the unique expertise I was bringing to the table. I told her my rate would be $1,100 per hour, with a 40-hour minimum engagement to cover the initial setup, system recovery, and post-incident hardening. This meant a minimum fee of $44,000. Furthermore, because I was now operating as an independent entity without corporate backing, I required a 50% deposit of $22,000 to be wired to my business account before I would log back into their servers. I explained that this deposit was necessary to cover my professional liabilities and setup costs. Teresa did not even hesitate. She told me to send over a simple letter agreement and the bank's wire routing details. I used my laptop to draft a standard consulting agreement, specifying the scope of work and the payment terms, and emailed the document to Teresa. Within 20 minutes, my phone chimed with a notification from my bank. The wire transfer of $22,000 had cleared and was sitting in my account. I sent a quick text to my wife, Sarah, letting her know that I had been terminated from my job but had just secured a contract that would pay us more in 3 days than I made in 3 months. She texted back a smiley face and told me to be careful. I packed my laptop and walked back to the Cascade Commerce data center. When I entered the server room, the atmosphere was completely different. Teresa and her team looked at me not as a corporate vendor, but as their last hope. I sat down at the main console, plugged in my specialized analysis tools, and resumed the process of extracting the decryption keys from the system memory. The physical environment of the server room was intense, with the loud hum of cooling fans and the cold drafts blowing through the aisles, but I felt a deep sense of confidence. I connected my custom hardware bus sniffer to the primary domain controllers to capture the memory registers. I was operating in my element, using the skills I had honed during my military service. I spent the next several hours mapping out the decryption flow, ensuring that we would not trigger any of the ransomware's secondary destructive routines. Every step had to be executed with absolute precision, and I worked methodically through the afternoon. As I worked through the afternoon, my security monitors suddenly flagged a series of unauthorized connection attempts on the bank's primary domain controller. Someone was trying to log in using my old administrative credentials from Apex Sentinel. The attempts were originating from an IP address registered to Apex headquarters in Boston. I immediately blocked the IP range and notified Teresa. It was clear that Dwight Briggs was panicking. He knew that if I recovered the bank's systems as an independent contractor, his career at Apex was over. He was desperately trying to access the network, using my credentials to copy the custom recovery script I had written, hoping to claim credit for the resolution. I watched the console as the remote user attempted to access the local recovery log in real time. It was Dwight's corporate account signature trying to run commands. I immediately ran a packet capture routine and saved the log files as ironclad evidence of unauthorized network intrusion. Before I did anything else, I worked with Teresa to isolate the bank's administrative network console, disabling the default remote services and enabling multi-factor authentication for any logins originating outside the Seattle facility. We also set up a honeypot server on a separate subnet to trap any further attempts. I wanted to make sure that if Dwight or anyone else at Apex tried to access our systems, they would be led into a sandbox where they could do no harm, but where we could log all their actions and record their IP addresses. I called my personal attorney, a specialist in technology and labor law named Joseph. I explained the situation, and he immediately drafted a cease and desist letter. The letter was addressed to Roger Albright and the Apex Executive Board. It stated that any unauthorized use of my credentials or attempts to access Cascade's servers using my proprietary methods would be treated as a direct violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Joseph was furious when he heard what Dwight was doing, noting that unauthorized access to a protected financial system using revoked credentials was a federal felony. Furthermore, the letter pointed out that attempting to use my digital signature to authorize system changes constituted forgery under California Penal Code. Section 470, as the primary domain controllers and remote management servers were hosted in a secure facility in California. Joseph sent the letter via email with urgent delivery confirmation, noting that we would report the intrusion to federal banking regulators and the Federal Bureau of Investigation if it did not stop immediately. The legal pressure was intense, and we knew that a federal investigation would ruin Apex's corporate reputation permanently. The response from Boston was almost instantaneous. Roger Albright called me directly, his voice shaking with anger and embarrassment. He assured me that the connection attempts had been terminated immediately and that Dwight had been suspended pending an internal investigation. Roger admitted that Dwight had lied to the executive board, claiming he had found a back door to recover the bank's files and was executing it. When the cease and desist letter arrived with the packet captures, the legal team realized Dwight was trying to steal my work and expose the firm to massive criminal liability. Roger begged me not to take legal action, promising that Apex would fully cooperate with Cascade's transition. I told him that as long as they stayed off the network and respected the boundaries, I would focus on the recovery and leave the legal matters a Zenio. To Joseph. After hanging up, I went back to work. With the corporate interference stopped, I could focus entirely on the server recovery. I spent the next 14 hours systematically decrypting the database clusters. The work was tedious, requiring me to verify the integrity of every single file to ensure no data corruption had occurred. The Lockdown 72 malware had encrypted the tables in a non-sequential pattern, which meant I had to run validation checks on each of the 18 database clusters. I did not take a break, drinking cups of lukewarm coffee and eating sandwiches that Teresa ordered for the team. The physical fatigue was real, but my Navy training kept me focused on the mission. I sat in the dimly lit server room, listening to the rhythmic beep of the routers and the constant whoosh of the cooling vents. Every database table had to be meticulously scanned and verified using my custom scripts. I had to ensure that no dormant backdoor files remained within the registry keys of the operating system. Even a tiny oversight of a few bytes could allow the attackers to reinfect the bank's entire structure next week. I took my time, refusing to rush despite the high stakes. This level of patience was something I had practiced during my long nights on the aircraft carrier's electronics deck, where rushing a repair meant a radar system could fail in mid-flight. By 4 o'clock on Sunday morning, the core database was fully decrypted and operational. I began bringing the bank's branch systems back online one by one. By noon on Sunday, the entire network was fully functional. All 38 branches were online, cash machines were processing transactions, and the customer portal was accepting logins. Total downtime had been exactly 48 hours, and the bank had saved millions of dollars in potential losses. Teresa was crying tears of joy as she thanked me. On Monday morning, Cascade Commerce Bank officially reopened for business with all systems running smoothly. Teresa Miller presented me with a check for the remaining $22,000 of my consulting fee, along with a bonus for my rapid response. As I walked out of the bank headquarters, I felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. I had not only resolved a massive crisis, but I had also established myself as a highly capable independent consultant. I spent all of Monday afternoon conducting a thorough briefing with Teresa and her technical staff. I walked them through the exact mechanisms of the zero-day exploit, showing them where the buffer overflow had occurred in the authentication modules. I handed over a comprehensive 50-page post-incident analysis report that I had compiled during the decryption process. In the report, I outlined the security patches I had implemented, and I provided a roadmap for hardening their systems against future attacks. Teresa was extremely impressed by the level of detail, noting that Apex Sentinel had never provided such thorough documentation. She promised that Cascade would keep me on a retainer to oversee their quarterly security audits. Word of the successful recovery spread rapidly through the regional banking community. Within 2 weeks, I received calls from 4 other regional credit unions and community banks in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Their leadership teams had heard about how Apex Sentinel had failed to provide emergency support, and they were terrified of finding themselves in a similar situation. They wanted to hire me to review their security setups and ensure that their systems were properly protected. I established Vance Cybersecurity Consulting and quickly signed 6 long-term consulting agreements. Each contract guaranteed a monthly retainer of $6,000 just for basic monitoring and system review, plus my active incident response rate for any emergencies. This baseline revenue alone was more than double my previous corporate salary, and I was just getting started. Meanwhile, the fallout at Apex Sentinel was severe. The board of directors launched an internal audit to investigate the Cascade Commerce crisis. They calculated that Dwight Briggs' decision to terminate me had cost the company approximately $2,300,000 in lost client contracts, expedited travel costs, and legal fees. Cascade Commerce had reduced their annual service agreement by $480,000, and two other major clients had followed suit. The board determined that Dwight had breached his fiduciary duty to the company by exposing them to massive operational and legal liabilities. He was summarily fired in November. In September, Roger Albright contacted me with a formal proposal. The board wanted to retain my services as an emergency consultant for their most critical incidents. They offered a contract that included a monthly retainer of $7,500 just to be available, plus my active rate of $1,100 per hour for any emergency work. I accepted the offer, as it provided a stable baseline of income while allowing me to remain independent. I was now earning 5 times my former salary while working half the hours. I finally had the work-life balance I had wanted for years, and Sarah and I could plan a comfortable retirement. I had proved that institutional knowledge has a price, and sometimes the best revenge is letting the people who underestimate you pay that price in full. I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. I was no longer just a name on a corporate roster, a line item to be trimmed during a budget crunch. I was a business owner, an expert whose deep understanding of legacy systems and modern threats was recognized and valued. My son, who was a software engineer in San Francisco, called me to check in. When I told him what had happened, he burst out laughing. He told me that my story was already circulating on technology forums and that I was becoming a bit of a folk hero among cybersecurity professionals, the guy who made the company pay triple to get him back. My daughter was relieved that I was no longer at the mercy of unpredictable managers like Dwight. For my wife Sarah and me, the future was secure. We had worked hard for decades, and the thought of corporate layoffs hanging over my head had always been a source of quiet anxiety. Now, that anxiety was completely gone. We had a financial buffer that could support us for years, even if I decided to stop working tomorrow. I sat in my new home office, looking out at the beautiful garden we had recently planted, and realized that getting fired was the best thing that had ever happened to my career. It had forced me out of my comfort zone and shown me what my expertise was truly worth. I was finally my own boss, and no short-sighted manager like Dwight could ever threaten my livelihood again. It was a wonderful feeling of freedom and peace. We could travel, spend time with our grandchildren, and enjoy the fruits of decades of hard work. I had learned that the most satisfying success is the one you build on your own terms, anchored by the skills and discipline that no corporate executive can ever take away from you.